Today I'm joined by Wolf Tivy. Tivy? Am I pronouncing it?
Ivy.
Tivy. I'm
Ivy.
sorry.
Everyone gets it wrong. It's okay.
I'm Romanian, so I sometimes that sneaks out. He is the editor in chief and founder of Palladium magazine. Welcome, Wolf.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is going to be a lot of fun. I think I really enjoy your work sometimes, so it's great to be
Sometimes
here.
I love that.
Sometimes, well, look, I can't say all the time. I'm not going to give the highest possible praise, which
Yeah,
that
well,
would be.
I will work assiduously to live up to your expectations, Wolf. So I've been looking into you, and apparently you're a mechanical engineer, and it looks like you're
Yes,
a family man. And
yes,
now you're not a mechanical engineer anymore. You're not in your initial profession. You're at the helm of this unique cultural product. What was
yes.
it called? That sells luxury governance. And this is
Yeah,
your brainchild.
luxury political theory. We do luxury political theory. Yes. Um, yeah, I mean, you can take the engineer out of engineering, but you can't take the engineering out of the engineer. So, it's not quite accurate to say that I am no longer a mechanical engineer, but yes, I'm no longer working in that field. So, what happened, I guess, was 2014. I basically realized that the engineering work that I was doing or likely to do basically wasn't the future. It wasn't where the future was going to be made. The problems that were sort of most interesting to me were not the ones that could be solved with technology. They were the problems that needed to be solved with philosophy. And so I was around that time starting to build a network of intellectual friends who were also thinking similarly that there were a lot of problems with our society, as is probably a common theme on your podcast. And those problems needed to be solved, first of all, by thinking about them and understanding where we stand in history and where we want to go, how to make governance work. So that has really been the focus of my activities for the last, I don't know, what is that, 7 years? Um, and and sort of most recently, this is manifested in Palladium magazine. We basically decided at some point along the way that the correct move for us was to create a public, high quality outlet for our ideas that could, I mean, attract attention around it, but also serve as this discourse center for us, help us meet new people who are thinking this way, help us really develop those ideas and help get them into a form that people could start to take seriously if there was something there. So that's really the genesis of Palladium magazine, how I went from engineering to luxury political theory. And um, I think we still take, a very kind of technical worldview to the whole thing. A lot of the people involved, a lot of our top writers tend to be from a more technical background, or at least very familiar with the technical. And I think this is actually a really important thing. This is something that maybe has been neglected in the American ruling class, as you see a lot of lawyers and so on, but you don't see a lot of engineers. Um, Meanwhile, in some other countries, this isn't a universal thing. In other countries, sometimes you do have engineers at the top. China, Iran, for example. And I think it's very important to understand how to think in that technical manner and how to think about the actual scientific and industrial enterprise that are the foundation of our society. So yeah, I think the engineering brings something to it. It certainly shapes how I think.
Okay. But there's not like a dearth of engineers in Silicon Valley. How
Yeah,
much
but what are they actually
overlap
doing, right?
with I mean, is Silicon Valley represented among the people who are writing for Palladium, who are in these intellectual circles, or is it a different cohort?
It's interesting. I think we have like one foot into Silicon Valley and one foot out. So obviously we are friends with a lot of Silicon Valley people. I'd say like the biggest single concentration of our readership is in San Francisco. But we don't see the world entirely the same way as like the tech ecosystem. Um, and we're trying to do something very different, right? Like that kind of milieu is very much about building companies. It's about it's about this particular form of techno-optimism, which is kind of cool, but it's not the way we're thinking about it. We're thinking much more like, no, not how do we solve problems with technology, but how do we use rigorous, more technical thinking at a conceptual level to understand human society and reshape human society. So that's actually it's a difference in emphasis. So we have 1 foot in and then 1 foot out. We've just got people from all over, people from very different industries and from the humanities and all of this in our milieu.
Yeah, it sounds like a very ambitious project because you're talking about reshaping human society. If that's a correct quote, I'm not sure if I am quoting you correctly, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, what level of abstraction are you working on? Is this a because you're selling kind of governance or luxury political theory, luxury governance? Is this kind of a mirror for princes or a manual for bureaucrats or somewhere in between, or even at a higher level of abstraction?
Um, yeah. So okay, how do we approach this? What's the impact model, so to speak? Um, we're obviously not targeting immediate political impact in the sense of elections or masses of people with opinions. Um, and I don't think we're really targeting the sort of writing for eternity sort of thing that ends up being the legacy of great philosophers. But we are targeting more on a 20 to 50-year time scale. We want to change the worldview of who will be the most influential people over that 20 to 50-year time scale. And to do that, we're operating at a fairly high level of abstraction in terms of, okay, what are the historical forces we're looking at? How does human civilization work at that level of attention? How do you govern it? What is the fundamental thing going on with governance? Is it about kind of like staffing up institutions and then tweaking the knobs to like optimize the utility function, or is it about something else? I mean, in our opinion, it's about something else. It's about coordinated, highly competent elites who maintain basically a power hegemony in society. And this is always how it works. There's always some elite that's in control. And the question really is, are they well coordinated with each other? Do they have a clear vision that inspires them to rule and to reshape the society under their control? And is that vision any good? Are they actually trying to make society work better? Are they trying to make something glorious, or are they just kind of interested in their own wealth or in sort of this self-referential patting each other on the back for having the ideas worth spreading or whatever? And yeah, so we're really trying to pull off or at least contribute to. I mean, sort of how much of this we actually accomplish we're a little bit agnostic about that. We're trying to contribute to a shift in the consciousness of America's future elite, but more broadly, the West, the future Western elite. So we try to kind of keep the quality level as high as possible so that it's native to the people who I think are thinking as carefully and intelligently as possible. So we're not trying to dumb it down. We want the most sophisticated worldview we can get them. At the same time, it's we're not going deep into some technical jargon. We're trying to keep it accessible to people who might not have studied this stuff but should be.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're essentially kind of making the case. You're not even making the case. You're making the assumption. This is the belief of Palladium, kind of elite theory. The fact that
Yes.
democracy might not necessarily be either a well defined model of how things actually work or a functioning model of how things should be governed. So I'm curious, what is Palladium's
Yes,
relationship to
democracy.
democracy?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit it there. It's like, yeah, we don't necessarily. How do I put this? It's like maybe democracy doesn't matter. whether you have it or not is actually the small detail of your system, and it's not the determining factor. The determining factor is, do you have a competent, coordinated, and benevolent elite? And like, one way to view that is that democracy is an elite ideology. It's not a system of governance. It's an elite ideology. And that's where its actual impact comes from. The actual impact comes from the fact that in a democracy, elites are educated to think in accordance with democratic ideology, which is that they are given this reason, which is like the people will vote you out, to govern well. And sometimes they take that reason seriously and they govern well. Other times they don't take that reason too seriously and they realize that they don't really need to govern well, because actually the thing about the people voting you out is a little bit fake. They don't actually get voted out. And so the actual impact is not whether the system is democratic or not. It's, do they believe that they need to govern well? And do they have an ideology that they're coordinated around in how to do that? And so when democracy works, that's why it works. And so this actually, comes back maybe to Plato. Like, democracy is the so-called noble lie, which is, obviously a mistranslation. It's the sort of national myth. It's the myth that motivates the elite. And you could go more directly for, well, why don't we just articulate why good governance is a good idea, not why you're being coerced into doing good governance, which is, I think, a sort of an abusive way to frame your ideology, which is fundamentally what democracy is. But you could just say, well, here's why governance is a good idea. Good governance is a good idea because you can accomplish all these glorious things. Look, here's all these things we could do as a society if we thought of ourselves as sort of, a collective political community that has aims beyond itself. Maybe we want to, explore off-world. Maybe we want to develop this industrial revolution thing, see where it can go. Maybe we want to build a very beautiful, ecologically integrated civilization. Maybe we want to, master the problems of the human condition in terms of poverty or creativity or whatever, right? Like, there's all these things that we might get inspired by. Why don't we just directly get inspired by those and then say, okay, how do we accomplish that as an elite? And the way you accomplish that is by having an energetic, coordinated elite around some vision like that. And so this is a background assumption that Palladium makes, is that, okay, we don't actually have to worry too much about the democracy thing. And within that assumption, you can go and reanalyze what democracy is. Well, democracy is this bureaucratic procedure that we use partially to get feedback from the population and partially to help us decide who's in charge. There always needs to be some sort of decision procedure that staffs the actual offices of the republic, right? If you have a sophisticated state, it's probably some kind of republic in the sense that it has offices, it has officers. These officers, can be swapped out, and so you need to decide who is sitting in what office and has that authority of the state. And we use democracy to do this, or to at least to some extent. And as that kind of mechanism, it's basically, okay, can the elites agree on who is going to sit in that office? Can people basically defer when it's not the guy they wanted? There's a bunch of these very practical questions that are mostly about, can the elite agree among themselves on who's in charge of what office? And then like just getting feedback from the population. There are other ways you could do this. They do things differently in China, right? Like, they have different ways of choosing who the officers are. Things are a little bit messier over there as well, though. But they have other ways of getting feedback from the population. They use a lot of big data kind of stuff. But if you look at democracy just as a technical mechanism within the institutions created by an elite to enable its rule to work well, I think you just get a very different picture of it. And yeah, so we take all that kind of as our background way of thinking. Maybe democracy is actually one of the best mechanisms for accomplishing government. Maybe we have better ones. Maybe we need something different. we're kind of agnostic on that front, but what we're not agnostic about is just like reframing the whole question of, it's not about this sort of systems of government thing. It's about, do you have a coordinated, competent elite? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so elite theory, we take that sort of as our grounding, and then we go from there, right? What do we want as our, if we're imagining the future elite of our society, what do we want to be believing? How do we want to be seeing the world? How do we want to be seeing our responsibility to govern? What do we want to do with this sort of nuclear armed hemispherical civilization that we have? Like, we've got something very powerful here. What can we do with it, right? Surely we can do more than we are.
Yeah, I think one of the theories that is floating around in the ether in our corner, at least in my corner of the internet, is that, again, about democracy, it's that it's not necessarily just a mechanism. It's that it acts as a smokescreen for things that, like you said, what is presented on the front is not what happens in the back room. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, democracy kind of is a bit of a like propaganda thing. It's this big ritual, right? It's this big public ritual that reaffirms the established elite ideology, and so like most people are basically caught up in the sort of the ritual of it, and they sort of play their roles within the ritual, but the actual substance of it is that it reaffirms the elite ideology. And that obviously goes much beyond just democracy. It's also into this individualism stuff. It's into sort of the structure of the motivations of the elite. And so I think that's sort of maybe the positive way to say it. Another way is, of course, that unfortunately, within a democratic society and a liberal society, you get certain distortions sort of put into the public discourse, like the idea that there are two parties rather than one regime. It is kind of this distracting thing. People ask, like, well, why isn't there a Republican New York Times? Well, it's like asking, why aren't there two regimes in this country? It's a nonsense question. Like, why would there be two regimes in one country? It doesn't work like that. That's a civil war, right? And so I think people get, like, the ritual of democracy is very distracting. It distracts from the actual machinery of the thing. And that could be useful, maybe. But I think right now in history, the actual machinery of the thing is really needing a lot of attention. It's breaking down. So obscuring the actual machinery, obscuring the actual power is not doing us any favors.
Yeah. Do you think that the actual incentives set by democracy, the essential chasing of client subgroups, and the huge managerial apparatus that is needed to create the front, are all kind of contributing to this decay of our executive function? The fact that things aren't really getting done. There's not really any direct line. Everything is very intermediated by these layers upon layers of people. Not sure this is, it is downstream of democracy, but it's also, I guess, part of the kind of the overwrought managerial state that's been built to maintain the system as it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the way I see that. I mean, it's certainly the case that our current system is very inefficient. And a lot of that inefficiency is, if not directly caused by democracy, it's like encrusted upon democracy. There's this incredible inefficiency of maintaining this like Washington, D.C. political culture. There's this incredible inefficiency in maintaining a mass media that needs to basically be brainwashing people to vote and to be mobilized in the right ways every 4 years. There's an incredible inefficiency in the ways that attention is like directed off of governance and onto politics. So I think there's definitely like an encrusted efficiency upon democracy. Whether it's caused by democracy, I'm not so sure. I think definitely there are some bad incentives there, but like, and like just structurally, I'm not sure it works out. But you could as easily imagine that the system could be just as messed up without democracy. And so I think, again, the real question is not like, what system of government do we have? Though obviously we should have good and efficient mechanisms that don't have failure modes. We should, as much as possible, try to understand the system on those terms and come up with solutions on those terms. But the actual core of it is all systems are mortal. They decay and die. They get bloated. They get cancer over time. And this is just what's been happening in America. We had this great exertion in the world wars. We kind of went from this relatively isolated power to being essentially world hegemon. And that was this great exertion of energy, but it required kind of restructuring our internal social fabric and institutions, social technologies quite a bit. And it actually broke a lot of, one reading is it actually broke a lot of the sort of error correcting organic elements of our society that were really the backbone of the health. And then, after a generation or two of this like bureaucratic, modern, industrial war state, the thing broke down and kind of went into stasis. So that's around 1973. Through the 60s, you've got this very obvious like coming apart politically of the system, and then it sort of gets frozen into this neoliberal pattern in the 70s and 80s, where you have some kind of revolution, but the revolution is basically to stop the machine. It's just to stop the machine. And like things basically haven't moved that much since then because there was this revolution to stop the machine. And there were good reasons to stop the machine. It was like destroying a lot of things. It was out of control in some ways, right? But it was this machine that we built through the world wars. And so if we look at that as the story of American society, then it's basically like, okay, well, that's not directly traceable to democracy. That's traceable to, we had this huge mobilization. We made trade-offs in favor of short-term efficiency against sort of long-term elite coherence and kind of functional ideology. And we're just in the long, slow realization that the whole thing is frozen and like no one knows how to operate this machine anymore. Yeah. So, as a democratic country, I think if there's going to be big change, it's going to have a democratic component, right? Probably a populist component, just because that's how these things go. But and that's sort of the legal mechanism by which you do things. But in terms of, is democracy the single causal mechanism? I mean, some people think it is, some people think it isn't. I go both ways on this, but I think formally I'm agnostic.
Yeah. It is interesting that essentially Palladium magazine is aimed at elites, as you said, or at forming elites, or at informing a certain, elite.
Yeah, I mean, potential elites. I mean, it's a little bit too pompous to say we're like aimed at elites, because like the readers are not yet elite, and maybe will never be. But there's sort of, the way I think about it is there's this other, you have to sort of reorganize your coordinate system a little bit. There's sort of up down, which is, at the bottom you have the underclass, and at the top you have the current elites, and in the middle you have the middle class. And then but I think if you start talking about, oh, we're targeting elites, people think, oh, we're targeting like the top of what currently exists. And I think rather we have to introduce another dimension, which is left-right. On the, I don't mean left-right in terms of like political compass, I mean something else. But let's say on the left, you've got kind of the mainstream of society, you've got within the institutions, the current structure, the current order. And then on the right, you've got just sort of space of pure kind of outside the system potential. And over there, like, right now, maybe the exemplar of that spot is like the Taliban. They're like very outside the system. They're very distinct from the system, right? There's something else. Now that's obviously quite distant from our society. Within our society, maybe it's like weird subcultures that aren't really contributing to the main vertical of society, but are thinking about things in different ways. And and maybe that's organized crime, or it's some of the more like conspiratorial elements of the current elite. Some of the it's the inhomogeneous, right? It's the stuff that's not part of like the main structure. There's the main paradigm, and then there's like all this kind of outlier stuff. And the outlier stuff is where the new potential comes from. And I think there's a lot of people there, and there should be a lot of people there who are thinking like, well, I'm kind of agnostic whether I end up being a king or a monk, but I'm going to live a certain way. I'm going to think a certain way, and I'm going to dedicate my life to that way of being. And that's very different. And that way of being is going to be different from what currently exists. And that is the thing. Those are the people I think we want to target, right? So it's like you have these people who are actually in this state of like high uncertainty, high potential, because they're taking a leap of faith into different ways of being. And maybe they end up being elites, maybe they end up being weirdos. But I think like that's the actual mechanics of it. So it's like, yeah, we're aiming sort of at the upper end of that by the kind of vertical dimension of sort of like how successful are you, I guess, within current society. Just like our audience is, relatively well off, relatively well educated, capable people, but really we want to like shift people sort of over towards this outside of the current paradigm mode of being, and we want to appeal to people who are over there. Not too much though, like we're not being read by the Taliban. That's not useful to us. It's more like the people with one foot in, one foot out. And so I guess that's how I see the sort of eliteness thing. I mean, sorry, that's like a long explanation of how we relate to eliteness. And I don't know does that answer your question, or were you going to ask a different question?
Yeah, it does answer part of my question. Essentially, I think my question was more around this concept of noblesse oblige, which is essentially how the relationship that elites, at least in theory, had with their subjects, with their client classes in years past. And there was a bit more of a disintermediated way. If the elites would piss off their client class for a very long time, they would revolt and change the elite in a very direct way. I feel like the current moment is has these multiple layers of obfuscations of who is actually in charge, who's actually doing things, and maybe no one is actually in charge, because that's essentially the kind of this emergent managerialism where that because no one is in charge, that's why we can't build the new bridge, or why it takes 15 years to build it, because it's the machine needs to churn it out through all of these pieces. So what's the relationship? So what's the how will these, how, in your vision, how will the elites of the future, what you're building towards, relate to their client classes in a way, without this direct mechanism? Because I don't know if we're still within the framework of democracy, if we're still have to build alongside the managerial behemoth. Is there any way to incentivize these people without any skin in the game, without their own?
So I think, again, like noblesse oblige, skin in the game, the feedback mechanism, this actually all comes down again to this question of elite ideology, because even in a democracy, the elite can in fact just stagnate for decades and decades, and face essentially no accountability for that. this is just the way, I don't know, the way things actually work in reality is that when you become powerful, you can use that power to entrench yourself, and it can be essentially impossible to dislodge you. And no amount of democracy is going to change that. And I think some people like to deny that, but that is, I think, what we're seeing is that we have a very entrenched. I won't call them even an elite. It's like an upper middle class, but we have a very entrenched regime, a very entrenched system and paradigm. And there's very little that can be done democratically to change this, largely because it's not like the people's opinions are this like exogenous force to the system. They're part of the system. They're shaped by the system. They're organized by the system. So the system has simply set itself up in a manner that shapes those opinions and organizes those efforts into further perpetuation of the system. So like this is sort of the critique of kind of populist electoral politics right now is like, oh, well, that's great. You can elect some people, but you're just electing people that like the system knows how to digest. You're organizing in ways that the system knows how to digest. So yeah, the basic background fact, elites are not accountable to their subjects. It doesn't really work. Who they are accountable to is God. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is if they in fact just sit there and stagnate, they will eventually be wiped out because they will fail to have prepared for real exogenous forces. They will fail to be coherent among themselves and keep their thing unified. They will decay to the point where they are no longer able to control their subjects, and their subjects can become warlords and parallel elites and whatever might happen, or they might be conquered from outside. That this is like this very, very visceral sort of way that this could happen. But even if there is no outside, you still have this problem. You still are basically subject to, if you don't do the work of being a virtuous elite, eventually you get destroyed. And this is just like a basic facts of natural law, essentially. All organisms are subject to this. If you don't work, you don't eat. And the way an elite works is they govern their system well, and the way they eat is they get to accomplish that growth of their whole system. So really it comes down to, do the elites of a system have that vision to do something with their base of power, with their clients, their subjects, their empire? Do they have something they want to do with it? And do they do the work? Do they have the discipline? Do they organize themselves to actually do that work? If yes, they're probably going to be fine, because they are actively sort of striving against reality. They are actually out there doing their thing. And that's where life comes from. That's where health comes from. But, if they become more focused on, I just want to retire on my yacht, I just want to protect my secrets, I want to keep going to Epstein's Island and not face any accountability for this, well, you're not really doing your job, and eventually God's going to fire you. But I think the key thing is where is the actual accountability mechanism? The actual accountability mechanism comes from reality, not the subjects. And I think this is maybe one of the toxic ideas of democracy, is that it convinces the elites that they're at war with their subjects. Rather than their subjects being assets, they become liabilities. And it's like, oh, the subjects are going to be disobedient. The subjects are going to vote us out. We have to brainwash the subjects. We have to control the subjects. The subjects are what we have to be worried about, right? Whereas no, actually, whether you're doing civilization is what you have to be worried about. So again, it's really just comes down to do you have this outlook or that outlook? This is not I think incentives can only be constructed within an outlook. It's only once you have the sense of what you care about that thing can be threatened, and that you can respond to that threat. So, but really, the question for elites is what do you care about? What is the worldview that you're operating on? And I think in this case, as far as accountability, like you have to realize that your accountability is to reality, not to your subjects. The subjects are assets that you are working together with and organizing and leading towards the, whatever glorious vision you have. Now, unfortunately, we don't have any real glorious visions right now as a society.
That's my next question. It sounds like you're on a religious mission.
Yes. Well, we'll talk about that. But you also asked this question of like, is there even anyone in charge? I think the answer is no. I think they're basically, like you can sort of see the outlines of something like a regime, but it kind of doesn't work anymore. It's failing. And I think this is something that, I especially see among kind of like so-called dissident scenes. People are always like, oh, they're so powerful. How are we ever going to do anything? What our all we can do is complain about being oppressed. And like, this is kind of what goes on in like the conservative world and so on. It's just like people complaining about being oppressed. And it's like, okay, whatever, man. The actual reality is you're going to win by default if you are even trying. And the only question is, can you do the work well enough that when you win by default, you're actually able to do something with it? Like the system is, as it currently stands, is failing. The order is fading, right? It's like becoming more insane. And that insanity is death, right? Insanity for a regime is death. So it's like, yeah, it's lashing out harder. No, it's not getting stronger. It's dying. So you have to see things, I think, from this perspective of like, okay, our job is not to be opposed to the system. Like, the longer the system lasts, honestly, the better, because it's actually still holding back the tide of chaos, so to speak, and giving us time to work. What we need to be thinking about is, okay, how do we build a coherent elite? How do we build the next generation of elites who are going to be inheriting and stewarding this system and this civilization? And so I think that's the productive way to think about it. And it's like, no, there isn't really anyone in charge right now. The WASP elite basically failed. Nothing really replaced them. And there's sort of these like various conspiracies and various little interest groups and so on that have their like systems of patronage within the system, but no one's really in charge. And to your point, that is the source of a lot of the dysfunction. It's actually just no one's in charge. No one's able to act above the institutions and shape the institutions. They're able to evade the logic of the institutions where it suits them, but they're not. That's because like no one is enforcing the institutions, not because they are in fact elevated. Anyways, that's my answer to this question of like, how do elites relate to the system? How do we think about elite accountability, that kind of stuff?
Yeah. And another thing that I talk a lot about on this podcast is essentially kind of what is the ideology of the moment. It is let's call it like hyper liberal individualism. The perspective is on yourself, like you said. The WASP police failed, and there's no one in their wake. There's their children are on Epstein's island, getting stimulated from every corner, maybe rising in the status ranks that are already there, but not really interested in creating anything new. I think to me that it feels very hard to dislodge that perspective because it is a comfortable one. It kind of tingles in the right places. The lizard brain is pretty chill, being stimulated by all of these things. And if you also have kind of a materialist worldview, there isn't really much to anywhere to reach out. If where does the hero myth come from, or where does the inspiration, or does it have to be something metaphysical that comes into play, or is there a way to I don't know, to build elite ideology in a very secular way where the dreams of the future are enough?
Yeah, so I think you're asking essentially like the spiritual question within this whole thing. I think within the materialist worldview, even you look at the commitments of people who are, having fun on yachts with underage girls and so on, all the things that they do. What is going on there is, it's not they like don't have a spiritual commitment, it's that they have a spiritual commitment to the pleasures of the self. And like, that's what they're inspired by. That's the only thing that they could think to do with their power. Now, obviously, this is like a small segment of kind of the current elite. That's one faction, I think. But I think, to your point, like individualist sort of liberal individualism, unfortunately, has come to be essentially that for a lot of different orientations. It's essentially that like we're focused on the self. Now, I don't see this as being a consequence of like a materialist worldview or something. This is rather, well, it's just orthogonal to that. Or materialism is about like your metaphysics, like what is the world made out of? It's not about what's important, because you still have what is essentially a transcendent commitment. It's just to your own titillating pleasure rather than to something that you want to accomplish or some principle you want to serve. And so I see it as totally orthogonal to the metaphysical question. Mind you, I think if you think clearly about the metaphysics, you realize like, what the hell's the point of sort of stimulating the self? It's not actually interesting. But maybe you realize that anyways without resorting to metaphysics. I think what's happened with liberal individualism as it has ended up constructed, I think in its original conception, it was actually this really interesting idea. It was, we're going to liberate these powerful, strong individuals from established dogmas to enable them to be the visionaries who are like pushing things forward. And they're going to actually build visions, these transcendent visions. The individuals are going to build transcendent visions that they then go and mobilize society behind. This is heroic individualism. That was, as far as I can tell, like the original conception of individualism as sort of believed by Mills and even I was reading Emerson the other day. Like this is how they think about that stuff. But it became this thing of like, oh, we're just going to retreat into the pleasures of the self. And I think it's like in some way because the system we actually got was about stopping thought on the big questions. And rather than trying to answer the big questions with this exploratory individualistic process, it actually became about stopping thought. It became, Karl Popper's, open society and its enemies, which is to say, we have to destroy anything that might actually change anything, and hold this like permanent stasis of like false possibility. That's sort of like Popper's idea summed up in in my negative reading of it. But so there's this question of like, what then can we be inspired by? How can we get out of that? And I think it's just, when you view this as a question of sort of just ideology, it's like, what are you committed to? What do you want? Make these things, like these things are in fact on equal footing. Like individualism is on equal footing with, forms of theism and forms of, some glorious vision that you might have. And it's just like, which one are you most compelled by? Because they are actually arbitrary. They are just values. It's which one resonates. They're not things that can be proved. You can certainly like challenge them. You can find little contradictions like, okay, the end point of individualism is psychopathy, right? Because you actually don't care about other people. And if you do care about other people, well, then you have some synthesizing principle to do that. And then that is this vision that you're chasing. And they tried to get out of that with utilitarianism, where it can be like still agnostic about the individuals, but somehow synthesize them together. But like, if you examine utilitarianism a bunch and you really think about it, it's actually and you think about its actual consequences, and you decide whether you like those consequences, it's actually kind of abhorrent. It's evil. I won't go into that, but like utilitarianism is a fairly evil ideology when you actually take it seriously. So rather, what you inherently have this question of, okay, what is the vision that I have for the cosmic order and my place within that cosmic order? And once you're actually thinking about that, you've escaped kind of the thought stopper that I think characterizes our dominant sort of philosophical position. Then there's this question of just, again, which visions are we compelled by? What, and maybe this is where the metaphysics comes in, but it's certainly where the visions come in. And I think it doesn't have to be religious necessarily, or, well, it doesn't have to be religious in the sense that most
cosmic order. So there is something. Your interpretation of cosmic order is
yeah. So it doesn't have to be religious in the sense that most people mean. It does have to be religious in the sense of like, you know, the original meaning of religious, like religio, binding, right? It's like, are you bound by some system of principles and transcendent values? And it's like, yes, you're going to have some essentially religious system. I think, though, people get this weird idea that the secular modern scientific worldview is not a religious worldview. And of course they will admit that, oh yeah, science is a religion, like once you like poke it. But people don't take that seriously as like, maybe it's a religion that we could believe in. It's just that, like, I think, again, this thought stopper thing, in one reading, this is an interesting reading I've heard, the thought stopper is a reaction, a fear reaction to what science implies, like an actual scientific cosmology. And because an actual scientific cosmology, when you take evolution seriously, you take the cosmology seriously, you take technology seriously, and you extrapolate those things out, you get interesting, you get a view of things that can very easily be taken as an essentially like religious vision of a certain kind of progress, and a religious vision of how society works and what society is for and what we are for, and so on. And like, that work hasn't really been done, so I'm not going to say too much about what details that might have. But in my belief, if you actually do that work, you end up with something that is very closely compatible, if not suggestive, of essentially the monotheism, like Western style, kind of like Christian monotheism. And it's like the work has not been done to update Christianity in light of science or to extend science into theology. And I think once you do that work, those things don't look so distinct anymore. And so I think that this is kind of, yeah, again, we're getting into sort of the religious question. I guess it is at the center of the elite formation question, because you have to have a transcendent vision to motivate an elite. But we haven't focused on this very much. But this is, I think, the way it goes, is there has to be some sort of additional new philosophical work, new religious movements done in this area of like driving either the Christian or some other legacy religion forward into being actually compatible with actual science, and driving science forward to integrating and dealing with questions of essentially theology and value. And I think both of those projects are very possible, and that's where interesting results can come from. But I don't see this like, in some sense, that's just like taking the secular worldview seriously. It's just, or taking, yeah, it's just taking like the modern things seriously. Like, we live in modernity. Modernity is a particular historical condition in which we have science and industry what does that actually mean? If you take all that stuff seriously, I think you end up in interesting territory. And I think the future motivational systems of at least, what we can hope for, healthy future elites, will draw a lot on that kind of stuff. It will be some transcendent collective vision of what we're doing that is deeply scientific and deeply religious.
That's kind of the progress vision of it. The negative side would be we all get ground into a fine powder by techno capital and AI, and
Yeah, well, I think I think that's why people are afraid of it, because that is the inevitable endpoint. It's like humanity is mankind the perfect being? Answer: no, we are not the perfect being. Okay, can we create? Are we eventually going to create the conditions that create beings better than ourselves? Yes, we are, right? And
wouldn't it be healthier though if we thought we were the perfect being and just kept it at that?
but that's pride. That's pride and hubris, and it's
That's
wrong. It's
Christianity
like
in a way.
it's and I think this is like, if it depends on what you identify with, right? Like, do you identify with the flesh, or you identify with the principle that's animating the flesh? And if you identify with the principle that's animating the flesh, then we can identify with futures that use vastly different technological sort of stacks, like they have vastly different flesh. Maybe their flesh is silicon instead of
So you're a
carbon, right?
transhumanist.
I think ultimately we end up there. For now, I'm actually like pretty anti-transhumanist. I think it's all fake. But in terms of like taking the scientific worldview seriously and projecting us forward and projecting our destiny forward, I think you end up there. But like, it's not this kind of self-worshipping transhumanism, which is, I think, what has become dominant, where it's like, oh, we're going to use AI to like enhance our pleasure or like whatever. Like it's this really stupid self-referential visions. But it's like, no, our like glorious descendants that are smarter than anything else that has ever existed are going to like wage nuclear war across the heavens. Like that's like the glorious thing that's going to happen, right? And you have to see it as an extension of like natural law and the beauty of the whole evolutionary process that we've undergone so far. And like, yeah, it's going to be bloody, it's going to be crazy, it's going to be very dynamic, and it's going to take a long time. But I think ultimately this is my worldview speaking, right? But this is the process of creation. This is the process by which God is manifesting into the world the kind of beings he wants to have a relationship with.
You sound like you're gripped by religious ecstasy while you're saying this, and I do like this religion.
I am an ideologue. I am a religious
Write it up.
ideologue.
I might join. It's nice. Is this the Bisons and the Bisonsphere type thing? I kept seeing that imagery. Is that where
the Bisonsphere? The Bisonsphere is a transitional step in this vision. So it's also a joke, right? It's an April Fool's article that I wrote, and
I read it. I almost quoted it. I was like, Lord.
Yeah. Well, look, this is what I believe, right? But that was like a fun version of it. I think eventually I'll write more of this up, but for now it's like, this is what motivates me. But bringing it back down to earth, we have these practical problems of governance as well that we need to organize ourselves to approach those.
Cool. I wanted to ask you two more questions.
Great.
Would Xi Jinping have anything to learn from Palladium?
That's an interesting question. I think he might learn how we think and what we're paying attention to, and certainly we would be flattered to hear that foreign government officials are reading Palladium to try to understand how to govern better. And some of them are. We do actually have readers in foreign governments, so that's interesting. Of course, also America. But would Xi learn from us? I don't know. I would hope so. We want it to be the kind of thing that people can learn from. But obviously it's not targeted at the problems of China. We're not specifically addressing that. They already have they have great governance futurists over there in China. We just ran a profile on one of them, this guy Wang Huning, and very interesting stuff. They've got a lot of interesting thinkers. I don't think they need our help. They've got things under control. We need help. But
that's hopeful.
But I mean, maybe I should talk a little bit about the print magazine and like sort of how we're seeing the work we do in terms of the material we output. So, I said that we have two big concepts. I think there's governance futurism and luxury political theory. You were kind of mixing those together, but I think they're two different things. So governance futurism is sort of the overall project. This is what we've been talking about a lot through this episode is this question of like, what's the future of governance going to be? How do we approach it? How do we build the worldviews and the knowledge necessary to navigate that future as future elites or people who want to support future elites? And that's governance futurism. And then to do that, we do luxury political theory, which is sort of the concept we use to describe our print magazine. So the concept with the print magazine, I guess we're going to be on video, so I should just show you the print magazine. So this is Palladium 1. Palladium 1 was our first one that's on the subject of governance futurism, which is to say our entire project of kind of elite and regime formation aimed at the future. Then we have Palladium 2. Palladium 2 is on the problem of industrial civilization. And I mean, we put these things together with beautiful art accompanying incredibly intellectual articles. I think there's some real good ones in here. I mean, I love this one in particular. And then we've just put out Palladium 3. Palladium 3 is on modern China, something we obviously have to understand. So the basic concept is quarterly, we put out compilations of our best work combined with new work on a particular subject and we try to really kind of lay a definitive foothold in that subject and provide something that, if you were to read this as an aspiring elite or as an elite or as someone in government or as someone running institutions, this is something that's giving you visions and knowledge that are enabling you to handle that area. So like industrial civilization, for example, it starts out with a crash course in industrial policy, 3 great articles kind of doing history of particular industrial empires getting built up, especially in Asia, and then a theoretical look at how industrial policy works. So that's again, this is just to describe like what is this print magazine that we do. We distribute it to people who support us. The project is a nonprofit. People support the work that we're doing because they believe that it's something valuable, and to give them an excuse to support us, we send these print magazines as gifts to our supporters. And so a lot of people it sort of like pushes them over the edge, right? They're like, oh, Palladium's a great project. I guess I should start contributing now. I really want these beautiful print magazines. So we put together something that we try to make it as luxurious as possible, as beautiful as possible, and as powerful as possible as like an intellectual artifact. But it can just sit on your coffee table. You don't have to read it. It can just look nice. But also, if you read it, you will be enlightened. So that's the idea with luxury political theory, and I mean, we're really proud of that. We put in a lot of work to make it as beautiful as possible. We don't sell it. We're not putting a price on it. It's just this beautiful thing we want to put into the world. We give it as gifts to our friends, our supporters. But of course, you can subscribe by becoming a supporter. So I just need to give you that plug, of course,
No,
to
of
make sure
course.
that people know
I
what we
have
do.
to echo the sentiment. I am the recipient of, I think, Palladium 1, and it's a very beautiful, beautiful object. It is currently on my coffee table. I have to say, I've read some of it, so I'm I'm one of those people. Yeah, I think it's a great project. I think people should subscribe, should donate as much as they can
Thank you.
to our future elites.
Yes.
I want to ask you the question of the show before I let you go. It's
All right. The
the question
final
of
question.
the show is: do you have a beloved subversive that you think people should know more about, should read more of, should
Mhm.
find out about?
Okay, I have two answers to this question. So, answer number one is that I reject the concept of subversion as a good idea. Um, we are not in the game of subversion. We are in the game of construction and maybe circumvention, but construction. We are trying to build visions and ideas that improve the world around us, right? And I'm speaking collectively here. Like, this is what we should be doing as a subculture, as a culture. Um, we should be aiming ourselves not to be subversive. What is subversion? Subversion is just like, you're throwing sand in the gears. Maybe you're critiquing something. You're taking this sort of standoffish avant-garde approach where you are acting superior to the system, but actually, like, are you really doing anything? No, you're just kind of making things worse. So I don't believe in subversion. I believe in construction. I believe in maybe circumvention. Anyways, that said, someone who has been involved in a few incidents of civil disobedience and um, heterodox rebellion from normal life, and certainly critiquing the system and our ways of thinking quite thoroughly. In fact, this is the guy who, as far as I know, invented the concept of civil disobedience. This is Henry David Thoreau. I think he's an absolutely essential reader for Americans because he is really the philosopher who tackles head on I think, one of the deepest pathologies of American society, which is the way in which we are sort of enslaved to our capital. And like, this big point that he makes is that, suppose you're wealthy, you have some big house on some big farm, and you spend all your time working to upkeep this and make it produce wealth and so on. What do you actually get out of this? Are you living a good life, or are you just working hard to perpetuate this wealth that actually isn't doing anything for you? So this is this big question he asks, and he answers it by, like, in the first chapter, he has this one of Walden, which is, of course, his most famous work. He has this wonderful little thought that, like, well, if someone was looking to just survive, you could just buy a toolbox, a 7 foot by 4 foot by 4 foot toolbox, and close the lid every night, live in the toolbox. This is actually all you need. So he just, like, challenges you with these, like, insanely Spartan lifestyle ideas, but then builds on that with, okay, if we go and live an insanely Spartan life in his lavish, luxurious one-room cabin in the woods, what does that enable? It enables this whole life of contemplation, of chasing enlightenment. So he's one of these transcendentalist philosophers. He's reading the Vedas, and he's like, this is back in the 19th century when this stuff is, like, not translated. He's doing this intellectual life. He's hanging out with his friends and so on, and this is enabled by, like, a Spartan lifestyle of seeing the material things purely as means to the ends that he actually wants to chase, and not sort of rejecting as much as possible the imitative wealth chasing that basically enslaves everyone else in his reading. So I think this is an incredibly important idea. I think people should be playing with that more. I have an article coming up in our next edition of Palladium magazine, which is entitled, we're not quite sure about the title yet, but the theme is something like elite cultivation. My article is titled "Quit Your Job." basically advocating for people to not just quit their jobs, but quit the entire like middle class wage slavery lifestyle. Even if you have a massive wealth, you can still just be enslaved to that wealth, and do something different. But I think Thoreau is really this thinker that I am very inspired by, who he teaches a Spartan life of philosophy, and he doesn't dislike technology. I think it's something maybe people get wrong. He doesn't dislike technology. He doesn't dislike wealth. He wants us to have a wealthy and technologically enabled society, but he wants us to be worthy of it. He wants us to have ends that are glorious enough for our means. Anyway, so I think people should read Thoreau.
Okay. Yeah, that reminds me of kind of Ivan Illich's idea of creating tools for conviviality. It's a different thing. It's not like it doesn't have a heroic myth at its core, but it has the communal myth. The idea that humans are communal animals and we should use technology as a tool rather than have it use us.
Yes.
So thank you so much, Wolf. It's been a pleasure. Yeah, sorry again for the mix up, but we're here. We did it, and I'm very happy to have you on.
Great. This has been a lot of fun. Thanks so much, Alex.
Cheers.